We're going to have to know a little bit of the Syrian and the Egyptian affairs. I said we wouldn't have to deal with that too much in the future, and we really won't have to, but we have to know a little bit of it tonight to understand properly the important events of Israel under the second part of Jonathan's reign. We've gone through chapter 9. We're in 1 Maccabees. We've gone through chapter 9, ending up with these last four verses, 70 through 73. And we've got an interesting change of events here. It's significant as far as Israel is concerned, because prior to this time, remember, Judas has been so successful as far as the Maccabean revolt, the Jewish resistance movement against the truculence of the Syrian overlords. Been very successful, but he's been successful in those under him by means of his warfare, his army, particularly guerrilla warfare tactics. And we're going to see a tremendous change here in the end of chapter 9, 1 Maccabees 70 through 73, because diplomacy enters into the picture. Now, it's not that we have to understand just that to understand what's going to be happening in the New Testament when we see Israel compromising, because just think back in Old Testament days. Many times we had unregenerate kings of Israel who, rather than going out and defeating the enemies of Israel, would play some hanky-panky in diplomatic circles and try to get some strings tied together and say, now, if you help me fight my enemies, then I'll help you fight your enemies. And God always says you're going to get in trouble whenever you do something like that. As a matter of fact, if you look back, for instance, in 2 Chronicles chapters 14 through 16, you find this same theme developing there, where earlier in the chapter, or earlier in the book, through King Asa, God had miraculously delivered the children of Israel. They had fought a battle back in chapter 14 or 15, along there in 2 Chronicles, against 1 million of their foes, and had won, as a matter of fact. But it doesn't seem to last long sometimes for Israel. Of course, she was an up and down people. And here God, whenever God had so miraculously delivered them, then the next chapter, you can't get to but chapter 16. And Asa is making an agreement with a pagan king, so we'll each fight each other's enemies. And remember, a prophet comes to him and says, "Thus saith the Lord, here's the word of the Lord to you, you should have trusted me. I deliver your enemies as I always have in the past." And he locked the fellow up. And that was a fellow prophesying that the Lord's eyes run to and fro throughout the whole earth to see whose heart is perfect toward him, and toward those the Lord will show himself strong. And Asa ends up dying for other reasons after that. But it's the same thing with the Maccabees here. They should have remained consistent in their tactics of warfare against their enemies. Don't bring into the picture Sermon on the Mount or New Testament or something. We're talking about Old Testament. It wasn't love your enemies and bring them into your nation and share your wives with their sons and their sons with your wives. No, it wasn't any of that. It was put to the sword or be put to the sword. And if you don't put to the sword and you're not put to the sword by them, probably there's going to be corruption as far as idolatry is concerned. Now, the Babylonian captivity, for the most part, has taken care of the problem of idolatry in Israel, but not the problem of joining by means of diplomatic ties and leagues and pacts other nations that will eventually get the people of God into trouble. When Jonathan learned of this, he sent envoys to Maccabees to arrange terms of peace with him and a return of the Jewish prisoners. Maccabees agreed and did as Jonathan proposed, swearing to do him no harm for the rest of his life. Fairly good terms to the agreement that he'll live a long life here, but that's dependent on how long Maccabees lives, the one who gives the terms, who can back up the terms. He sent him back the prisoners he had taken previously from Judea. Israel is known today as a prisoner swapping country. She'll give 500 rebels to get 2 Israelis back. That's because she loves her own people. Never again did he enter their territory. So forth, so the war came to an end in Israel. Jonathan took up his residence in Michmash and began to govern the people, rooting the godless out of Israel. Which, kind of seems fine, and people might go right over these last 4 verses and not see the significance involved. But you'll see that as we get into the next chapter here. We're going to be covering probably chapters 10, 11, and 12. Maybe we'll get into Simon's rule and high priesthood. We'll have to see how long we go here to start with, which will be the last 12 years of Jonathan's life. Remember, chapter 9 covers, if you're looking at your chart, the end of chapter 9, the last two-thirds from 160 down to 153. Last week we were discussing, if you will remember, the high priesthoods of Jason, Menelaus, and Alcimus. And that brought us up to Jonathan. We see that Alcimus, his high priesthood probably ends right there around 160. And you see in parentheses, no high priest. We have a temporary lapse as far as the high priesthood is concerned. There are still priests and Levites, but no high priest. Jonathan, right in line with his brother Judas, if you look to the left of Jonathan's name, there's Judas, is the military leader of the nation. But whenever you get down to 153, which is kind of what we'll be talking about, it's around that date here in chapter 10. 153 down to 142, now they have Jonathan's name lifted up. Jonathan appointed high priest. We'll see that here in chapter 10. And more or less made a king. That's in quotation marks, a quasi-king from 163 down to 142. Dropping below that, you can see we're talking, or we will be talking about Ptolemy the Seventh. Cleopatra, that Cleopatra won't come into the scene too much, I don't suppose. It looks like we're still talking about Demetrius the First, Soter, Alexander Ballas, Demetrius the Second, and Antiochus the Sixth. And believe it or not, we'll have to be kind of discussing all of those names, all of those people this evening. Okay, here's what's going on if you want to start writing if you haven't already. Demetrius the First Soter is king at this time. We're talking about 153. He was the son of Seleucus IV, which made him the nephew of Antiochus Epiphanes, which made him the cousin of Antiochus Jupiter. And all of these guys have come from Antiochus the Great. So on your chart, 187, Seleucus IV, and then Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, of course, are brothers. And then Antiochus V is the son of Antiochus IV, and Demetrius I is the son of Seleucus IV. That makes Jupiter and Soter cousins then. Demetrius becomes king in 162. And things go fine as far as his kingship is concerned until the year 153. By the way, I think we're going to be caught up so much in our time tonight, we won't discuss that little note underneath the name Soter, 154, Jewish temple built at Leontopolis, Egypt, by Onias IV. We'll probably come back to that hopefully next week if I can remember to come back to that. But anyway, we don't have, in other words, what made me think of that is the fact we don't have any other notations, any other comments under the name Demetrius I. But something does happen in 153 that's going to upset the reign of Demetrius I, that is going to have catastrophic and cataclysmic events in Israel, especially as it will relate to Jonathan as the leader. In 153, a man claiming to be the son of Epiphanes landed in Ptolemais, took over the city, which remember is part of Syrian territory, took over the city, pronounces himself the new king of the Syrian government. And his name was Alexander Epiphanes, claiming to be the son of Antiochus Epiphanes. Alexander Epiphanes. Since he was the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, then he claims naturally to be the rightful heir to the throne in Syria. Now, history has not retained for us the truth or the lack thereof conclusively whether or not this man really was a legitimate descendant of Antiochus Epiphanes. In other words, there are some sources that seem to suggest he was only a very wise pretender to the throne, that he was not related in any sense of the word to Epiphanes. Other sources in history seem to indicate that he was the legitimate son of Epiphanes. So be that as it may, we can't explain it. We can't conclusively explain it one way or the other. It's hard to say. He either is a pretender or he's not a pretender. But we do know one thing from history. History conclusively gives his name as Alexander Ballas. That's the way he has become known in history, as Alexander Ballas, B-A-L-A-S. Just the change of the name there from Epiphanes to Ballas would seem to indicate that perhaps those sources suggesting to us that he was merely a pretender and not a legitimate rightful heir to the throne could be true, because he has a name that in no way is related to what would be the name of his father, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And he's mentioned on your chart, if you look far enough down, Alexander Ballas. Whenever he lands, this is according to chapter 10 of 1 Maccabees, verses 1 and 2. He has all of the backing of Egypt. He has all the backing of Rome. Remember how important Rome has become now, playing around in her lake in the backyard, the Mediterranean Sea. And he has all the backing of the Asia Minor provinces as well. We'll read these couple of verses, then we'll go on. In the year 160, that's according to the Seleucid reckoning, so that for us is probably around 153 B.C., Alexander Epiphanes, son of Antiochus, now there we've got his name Epiphanes, son of Antiochus, and he's called son of Antiochus. So here's one of the sources that tells us that it is Epiphanes' son. Came and took possession of Ptolemais, where he was welcome, proclaimed king. And when King Demetrius I Soter, who we know to be the true son of Seleucus IV, when Demetrius heard of this, he raised a huge army and marched out to meet him in battle. Before going on, let me tell you what's going to happen here in the chapter. Both of these men, both Demetrius in the first place and Alexander Ballas in the second place, see the importance of having Jonathan, the help of Jonathan, and him being on their side. So both of them are going to make overtures here in the chapter, and obviously it's the one that provides the highest bid that Jonathan probably will accept. In verses 3 through 14, we see the overtures made by Demetrius. Verses 15 through 20, those offered by Ballas, Alexander Ballas. Notice we're talking about 153, so we're talking about 3 years earlier than the date you have here on your chart, although we'll get down to that date here in a moment. Now, it's interesting to me that Jonathan and this group of rebels, they haven't existed now but just over a score years or so, have become so important in the affairs of the Middle East that now two people who are vying for the kingship of Syria see them as playing a pivotal role, the people down in Israel, Jonathan and his comrades, and really the whole nation, because he, not high priest at this time, we'll see that here in this chapter, but he, as military and political leader, holds a tremendous sway over the people and over the country. We've even seen earlier, the last verse of the preceding chapter, that he roots out the godless. Those are the renegades, the Jewish apostates, those with a Hellenistically bent mind. He roots those out. So with them excluded, he holds great sway over the country as far as the Orthodox Jews are concerned. And he must hold sway in more ways than one for these two kings to be so interested in him. Verse 3, at the same time Demetrius sent Jonathan a letter in friendly and flattering terms, saying, let us forestall Alexander. He's wanting the help of Jonathan against Alexander. That's down through verse 14. Then verse 15, King Alexander heard of the promises which Demetrius had sent to Jonathan, and was told of the battles and the heroic deeds of Jonathan and his brothers and the hardships they had endured. And here's what he says, where shall we ever find another man like this one? Let us make him our friend and ally. He therefore writes a letter to this effect, so forth, verses 18, 19, and 20. Well, Ballas happens to offer the higher of the bids. Ballas over against Demetrius. So Jonathan accepts the friendship of Ballas as opposed to Demetrius, which is going to bring Ballas eventually to the throne. What does it gain Jonathan? Remember, he's already been friends with Demetrius now, because Demetrius was king, way back in chapter 7, I believe. Chapter 7 and verse 1 is where we see Demetrius coming to the throne. So this Maccabees in chapter 9, verses 7 through 70 through 73 is just, an info. He's the military general, remember, who is sent under the commission of Demetrius. So Jonathan is on good terms with Demetrius until someone offers him a higher bid. Now, that's kind of the same situation, but in reverse from what we've seen earlier as far as the high priesthood was concerned in Israel. The kings would let anyone be high priest at that time until someone came later with a higher bid. And whenever they could bribe their way into the high priesthood, they would go in. Well, Jonathan is allowing the entrance of, too much of an entrance of a connection between these two nations in, simply on the basis of the higher bid that's offered by Ballas. Now, we're not told a lot of what it includes here in verses 18 to 20, but it had to be more favorable, obviously, or there'd be no reason for Jonathan to accept that. So he does accept that. The end of verse 20 and verse 21 are important. I have a big red star out beside it. Jonathan accepts. He's made high priest, and he's given a golden crown and a purple robe as a quasi-king in Israel. And this is around 152 BCE. 152 BC. Very interesting situation here. Why do we say interesting? Well, it's because it was totally forbidden of the Jews to have invested in one personality the religious zenith, that is the high priesthood, and the political zenith, the kingship, forbidden until the time of Jesus, where he was to fulfill both the religious or the spiritual role and the kingly political role in Israel as well. For instance, if you look over in the book of Zechariah, we have a problem passage there, but obviously it has reference to Christ. In the book of Zechariah, concerning this very question, chapter 6, of one man being priest and being king. Zechariah chapter 6, beginning with verse 9. The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, take of them of the captivity, these various people, then take silver and gold and make crowns. Now who wears crowns? Well, kings. And set them on the head of Joshua. Now who's Joshua in post-exilic Israel? The high priest. Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest. Set crowns on the head of Joshua. Well, see, that's totally contrary to everything. God kept them separate. God said, now here's the Levites. They'll be my inheritance and I'll be their inheritance. They get no land because I am theirs and they are mine. And they was to typify things. But that was to be a special group of people. The priest and obviously the high priest would come from that tribe. Kingship, that was supposed to come through David. If it's a legitimate king, David and his son's son on down the line. And what tribe did David come from? David. Judah. Judah was, what tribe did Jesus come from? Judah. Remember that verse, that interesting verse over in, Hebrews 7? Hebrews 7. Remember, the book of Hebrews is trying to show how Jesus is a better high priest than Aaron. It starts back in chapter 5, but it's earlier than that as well. But he's showing that he's a better high priest than Aaron because he's made a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And we read here in verse 13, for he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. Who was to give attendance at the altar? Well, people from the tribe of Levi. And he said, the man that we're talking about, he's talking about the man Christ Jesus. He's from another tribe. Another tribe? Another than what? Well, verse 11, Levitical priesthood. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. Obviously he spake nothing, and he didn't of Gad or Dan or the rest of the group, only of the son Levi and of his descendants. Well, anyway, back to Zechariah 6 and verse 12. We're just kind of adding this in for free for you to think about on your own. Speak unto him, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts. But it was something that was very important theologically in Israel. Remember the one time that the king did try to go in? Who was that? Uzzah tried to go in, or Uzziah tried to go in and offer incense on the altar. And the priest said, Don't go in, don't go in. And the Lord smote him with leprosy, and he was a leprous soul until the day of his death. One reason was because he tried to cross over this wall, this barrier that was not to be crossed over, from Levi to Judah, or from Judah to Levi. Speaking to him, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, Behold, the man whose name is the branch. If you've got old King James, it's probably all capitalized, and really, it's because they recognize this to be a messianic prophecy here. The branch, and he shall grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Even he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory, and shall sit, watch this, and rule on his throne. Now, who sits on thrones? Kings. And he shall be a what on his throne? A king on his throne? A priest on his throne. The council of peace shall be between them both. Now what are we talking about there? That's where it gets in a problem. Now we're talking about two people again, one king, one high priest. Well, we'll leave it at that. Getting back to our account, 1 Maccabees and Jonathan, chapter 10, into verse 20 and verse 21. Interesting situation with Jonathan being high priest and Jonathan being king. Now, what tribe is Jonathan from? Do you remember that? What tribe is Jonathan from? Is it more legitimate for his kingship or for his priesthood here? Priesthood, why? He's a Levite, right? Remember his father, Mattathias, the what? The priest of Modin, was from the first of the 24 orders of priests. So it's fine as far as that part of it is concerned. Now, high priesthood is something else. He's not in the Aaronic line for high priest. So that's a mistake of his right away. And of course, it's really a mistake as well being king, although, you know, whatever happens, happens in the intertestamental period, because he's not descended from David, because he's not a part of the tribe of Judah. Well, we haven't even looked at the verses. Look at this. He sent him a purple robe. Now, you probably know that in Oriental countries, purple is the color of majesty. He sent him a purple robe and a golden crown, which speaks of his kingship, quasi-kingship. Jonathan assumed the vestments of the high priest in the 7th month of the year 160 at the Feast of Tabernacles. And he gathered an army together and prepared a large supply of arms. Very interesting development here in Israel again. And both of these relate to Jonathan. Verses 70 through 73 of the preceding chapter, and the change from military tactics to those of diplomacy. And now we have in one personality, in one persona, we have the combination of the kingship and of the high priesthood. Anyway, let's go on and see what the rest of the chapter holds for us. In verses 22 then down through 47, 22 through 47, although Demetrius sees that he is lost as far as his bid to Jonathan is concerned, he's lost in favor of Balas, we read there in verse 22, he's mortified of the news. And so, he asks, how did we allow Alexander to forestall us in gaining friendship and support of the Jews? So I too will send cordial messages and offer honors and gifts and so forth to keep them on my side. And that goes all the way down through verse 47, but he's not successful. He promises, in other words, Demetrius promises him all types of goods and all types of privileges and a release on taxes and all of this type of stuff to see if he can gain him back from Balas. And he can't. For instance, verse 32, I also surrender authority over the citadel. Remember how often we've run into that before? in Jerusalem, which means the Syrians must still be in control of that, and grant the high priest the right to garrison it with men of his own choice. And he goes on saying, verse 36, they will be enlisted in the forces of the king to the number of 30,000 men. They will receive the usual army pay, and he's going to allow them to be without taxes in many cities and so forth. But Jonathan doesn't accept. He accepted the offer of Ballas, and it is with that offer that he remains. In verses 48 to 50, the two men finally come to battle. Alexander Ballas, Demetrius I Soter, finally come to battle. Verses 48, 49, and 50, with Ballas ending up as the victor. And once he ends up as victor, then Jonathan is invited to his court for a lot of shenanigans to go on, which is nothing new ever since the end of chapter 9. And for the first time now in a long time, the king of the south. Remember kings of the north and south in Daniel 11? Well, the king of the south enters into the picture. We're talking about the Ptolemy on your chart. We're talking about the Egyptians, where Ptolemy, this is starting in verse 51, Ptolemy sends a message to Alexander, Ballas, the new king now, saying that he will make him his son-in-law. That is, he'll give another daughter away. All these Cleopatras down in Egypt, remember, there's not just one, there are many of them. And he does do that. Verse 57, in the year 162, Ptolemy set out from Egypt with his daughter Cleopatra and arrived at Ptolemais, where King Alexander met him, and Ptolemy gave his daughter in marriage. The wedding was celebrated in royal style. How else could it be? With great pomp. And we're around 150 BC here. Then we see Alexander inviting Jonathan to come to his court, verse 59, down through verse 66. So verses 51 through 66, we really have two things. We've got Jonathan going to the court, but first of all, we have Ptolemy coming to the new king. Now, another twist in the events is seen in verses 67 through 89. Verses 67 through 89. Demetrius had a son, another Demetrius, Demetrius II, who arrives on the scene around 150, or shortly thereafter, and he's going to attempt to take the throne away from Ballas. This is somewhere from 150, maybe down to 148 or so. Demetrius II arrives on the scene to make an attempt to take the throne away from the new king, just crowned in 150 BC, Alexander Ballas. And basically in these verses 67 through 89, we see that Demetrius II is defeated by Jonathan. He gets a little too close, and Jonathan comes out with his troops. He's high priest, but he's still a military leader as well. And he comes out and he's successful in warfare against this new supposed usurper to the throne, Demetrius II. Then we've got the last two verses. When King Alexander heard all this, that is what Jonathan had done toward this soul who was coming to take the throne from him, he did Jonathan still greater honor. He'd already come to his court once before, sending him the gold clasp, which it is the custom to give to the king's kinsman. And he also gave him a city. Okay, we up so far. Chapter 11. Chapter 11, we're going to have change in events as far as who ends up being king, because Ptolemy comes into the picture again, this time against his son-in-law. He's going to use some guile and subtlety against his own son-in-law, Alexander Ballas. Verses 1 to 19. Verses 1 to 19, Ptolemy, who was the father-in-law of Ballas, comes in wanting to take Syria, take it by guile. So he turns his attention toward Demetrius and begins to flatter him, and begins to turn him more against Alexander Ballas so that he can win control of Syria. We'll have to read a few of these verses so you can see the picture of what's going on. But Ptolemy comes in, and now he's going to be working, remember, against his own son-in-law. Just in the preceding chapter, he has given his daughter Cleopatra to Ballas in marriage. And now we're going to see just the reverse of that. He's going to take his daughter away. King of Egypt collected a huge army, countless as the sand on the seashore. Just a hyperbole, of course. A great fleet of ships, meaning to make himself master of Alexander's kingdom by treachery. This is his own son-in-law. And added to his own. So he sets out for Syria with professions of peace. The people of the towns proceeded to open gates to him and go out and meet him. Why? Well, King Alexander had ordered them to do this because of his relationship with Ptolemy. And as he went on his progress from town to town, Ptolemy left a detachment of troops in each of them as a garrison. Wonder why he's doing that? Well, covering his tracks. Everything will be secure whenever the final gun goes off. When he reached Azotus, he was shown the burnt temple of Dagon in the city, rails on Jonathan and asked the king to do something. End of verse 5, but the king said nothing. Verse 8, King Ptolemy made himself master of the coast towns as far as Seleucia by the sea. He was harboring malicious designs against Alexander. So he sent ambassadors to King Demetrius with the following message. Goes on, verse 11. Well, I better read that. I propose that you and I should make a pact. I will give you my daughter, now presently Alexander's wife, and you shall reign over the kingdom of your father. I now regret having given my daughter for him, for he has tried to kill me. That's a lie. We don't have any hint of that at all. Verse 11, he maligned Alexander in this way because he coveted his kingdom. And so he took his daughter away and gave her to Demetrius. This led to a breach between him and Alexander and to open enmity. Ptolemy now entered Antioch, where he assumed the crown of Asia. Thus he wore two crowns, that of Egypt, that of Asia. King Alexander at the time was up in Cilicia because of the revolt of the subjects there. Verse 16, Alexander fled to Arabia for protection, and King Ptolemy was triumphant. One of the chieftains there in Arabia lopped off his head and sends it back. So it looks like everything's going well for Ptolemy. He's now king of Syria and now king of Egypt. But 2 days later, Ptolemy died. So his plans fall through. And his garrisons in the fortresses were killed by the inhabitants. So you have to move down on your chart a little further. We're down to 145 BCE. Demetrius II becomes king. Demetrius II becomes king. And you see it's kind of ruling along with and overlapping Antiochus VI, because Demetrius comes first, and then just a short time later in the same year, Antiochus VI will become king as well. So verses 1 to 19, the control then of the empire, first of all, goes from Ballas to Ptolemy. Ballas ends up with his head lopped off. Ptolemy dies 2 days later. So thirdly and finally, control of the kingdom switches to Demetrius II. Okay, verses 20 through 37. Verses 20 through 37. Jonathan sticks his head in the picture again and wins the favor of Demetrius II. So there's always this shenanigans going on as far as their diplomacy is concerned. Verses 20 through 37. It's recognized to be, in the end of verse 23, a dangerous mission. We read that Jonathan set out on a dangerous mission. But he's successful. He won the favor of Demetrius, although some renegade Jews tried to lodge complaints against him. But the king treated him just as his predecessors had done, honoring him in the presence of all of his friends. He confirmed him in the high priesthood and in all his former dignities, and appointed him head of the first class of the king's friends. And this is a Jewish man, Jonathan, a Levite of all things, appointed him head of the first class of the king's friends. And he asked to be exempted from taxes in verse 28, and Demetrius grants some of that, and we'll see some more of that later. Verses 38 through 51. There's no other way I can do this but outline the whole book like this and take our time reading it. And you know we're getting towards the end of the book. Only a few more weeks and we won't be using Maccabees anymore. Verses 38 through 51. Verse 38 really says it all there. Demetrius II is going to end up in serious trouble. He has the kingdom now Ptolemy is off the scene. Alexander Ballas is off the scene. So things appear to be going well for him. And because they appear to be going well for him, he thinks, well, why keep all these troops around? They're just an added expense to have to pay and feed these men, so we'll let the majority of the troops go home. He thinks that everything is going fine and well as far as he's concerned. And they are. When Demetrius saw the country was quiet under his rule and resistance was at an end, he disbanded all his forces, sending every man home with the exception of the foreign mercenaries that he had hired from the islands of the Gentiles. Then all the troops enlisted under his predecessors turned against the king. And here's the man who's going to become important, a certain Trypho, just an enemy, a Syrian enemy of the king. A certain Trypho is going to try to get the remaining son, and he's on your chart as Antiochus VI, who's just a boy at this time, just a child at this time, and who's under the custody of an Arab chieftain. All this is mentioned in verse 39. He's going to make an attempt to have him become the new king. And of course, since Antiochus VI is a boy, who really wants to be king? Well, Trypho does. But yet he's not in the legitimate line, whereas Antiochus VI is. So of course he's going to work through him, use him as a puppet king to say the least, and hopefully later dispose of him so that he can be the new king. So Ballas has a son named Antiochus VI, who as just a boy is under the charge of an Arab chieftain. Ballas had been over in the Arab territory for a while, and that's where he got his head lopped off in verse 17 of this chapter. And so Trypho stirs up the revolt of all the people, including the king's own army, that is the army of Demetrius. And guess who saves the king's life? Well, the only people who really respond in favor of Demetrius are Jonathan and his men. So the Jews are sent by Jonathan to save the king and to save his capital city. Let's start reading in verse 41. We're looking at verses 38 to 51. Meanwhile, Jonathan sent to King Demetrius. Jonathan probably doesn't really know what's going on up in Syria at this time, requesting him to withdraw from the citadel, we're back to that again, in Jerusalem, and from the fortresses, the garrisons which have constantly been harassing Israel. Demetrius sent Jonathan this reply: I will not only meet your request, but when opportunity arises, I will do you and your people the highest honor. And now be so good as to send men to support me, for all my troops are in revolt. I've always been amused at this little letter. It's pretty easy. Sounds like he's got the victory in the Lord here, not too worried about anything, Demetrius. I think you'd be sending a letter saying a lot more than that. Well, I'll do that if you'll send a couple of guys up here and help me out. He's got a revolt of tens of thousands of people against him. I don't know how true that letter right there is, in other words. Jonathan dispatched 3,000 fighting men to Antioch, and the king was much relieved at their arrival. The citizens poured into the center of the city, 120,000 strong, bent on killing the king. So he takes refuge in the palace while the citizens seized control of the streets and fighting broke out. King Demetrius called the Jews to his assistance, and they rallied to him at once. This is Jews fighting in favor of the Syrian king. I mean, Epiphanes has almost wiped the country off the face of the map just a few years earlier, and they're rendering assistance to the Syrian king. They dispersed all over the city and slaughtered that day as many as 100,000. Setting the city on fire and taking much booty, and thus they saved the king's life. I don't know about the figures, 3,000 Jews and they killed 100,000. That's tremendous. God must have been with them or something, but it sounds more like the devil was with them to get a closer league between them and the Syrians. Anyway, that goes down through verse 51. A new section, verses 52 through 59. Verses 52 through 59. Demetrius has been successful because of the help of Jonathan. And we had read earlier in verses 42 and 43, he promised to reciprocate, and he doesn't. 52 through 59, Demetrius II breaks off relations with Jonathan. And Antiochus VI is made king and becomes friends with Jonathan briefly. Everybody's friends with someone else briefly. Thank God for Christian friendship. It is supposed to last anyway. You know how it is in the world, and this is really a worldly picture here. Everybody is friends for only so long. But when King Demetrius was secure, he went back on all of his promises. Verse 54, after this, Trypho returned. He's the one who's been trying to get the son of Ballas on the throne. With him, Antiochus the sixth, the son of Ballas, a mere lad, and Antiochus was crowned. That's why you have both of them on your chart. Demetrius the second, Antiochus the sixth, beginning the same time. Although Demetrius is probably a few weeks or months earlier, it's around the same time. All the forces of Demetrius had so contemptuously discharged rallied to the king. These fought against Demetrius, and he was utterly routed. Trypho brought up his elephants and made himself master of Antioch. The young Antiochus wrote to Jonathan confirming him in the high priesthood with the authority and so forth. So he's going to end up friends only for a while, down through verse 59. Then verses 16 through 74. Finish outlining the chapter, 60 through 74. Their forces end up fighting, Jonathan and the new Syrian king. Two Syrian kings now. But Antiochus the sixth and Jonathan end up fighting, and Jonathan wins. The last verse, that day about 3,000 of the Gentiles fell. Jonathan then returned to Jerusalem. Okay, chapter 12, we're going to see the defeat of Jonathan and his capture. Although we will not see his death, I don't think, until the next chapter, 13. But chapter 12, we're going to see the final, ultimate defeat of Jonathan, and he's going to be captured by the forces of the Syrians. First of all, verses 1 through 23, he makes a treaty with Rome and Sparta. Do you remember that we've talked about that situation before in chapter 8, I believe. In chapter 8, verses 1 through 16, or 1 through 22, really, we see how important Judas, this is when Judas was still alive, he's killed a third of the way through chapter 9, how important Judas feels the Roman people to be. They're great people. If you get on their side, they'll never forsake you. If you're against them, you've got a formidable war machine coming up your door then. So verses 1 to 23, Jonathan makes a treaty with Rome and Sparta. He makes a treaty with Rome because of their renown in the area, and it seems to be as though part of the reason for the treaty with Sparta is some ostensible blood kinship between the Jews and the Spartans. I'll point out that verse here in a moment. And it's mentioned over in 2 Maccabees as well, towards the end of the book, which we're through with the book, of course, looking at it now. Jonathan now saw his opportunity and sent picked men on a mission to Rome to confirm and renew the treaty of friendship with that city. They've talked with them earlier back in chapter 8. And he sent letters to the same effect to Sparta and to some other places. We have in verse 5, here follows a transcript of the letter which Jonathan wrote to the Spartans. Read a few verses that are interesting here, like verse 9. Now here's Jonathan's letter to the Spartans. He wants to make a treaty with them, and here's his reasoning. We do not regard ourselves as needing such alliances. Well, then why did you make it? Since our support is in the holy books in our possession. Notice he's got mental assent to the truth here. The holy books tell us that God will fight for Israel. And so really we don't need alliances with others. But although it's mental assent, it's head knowledge, it's certainly not in his heart. Nevertheless, we now venture to send and renew our pact of brotherhood and friendship with you, so that we may not become estranged, for it is many years since you wrote to us, and so forth. Sounds like a compromise to me in verse 9, a compromise of their faith. But anyway, verse 21, a document has come to light which shows that Spartans and Jews are kinsmen, descended alike from Abraham. You say, how true is that? Well, we could get into a long, really confusing explanation of what this document was and what this document has to say, but it appears to be a mistake. It appears to be a mistake of interpretation. Not translation, but a mistake of interpretation in some earlier genealogies. So I'll just say, and this is just, I guess, a surface view here, as far as I am aware, the Spartans and the Jews were not related. The Spartans were from a different stock of people, and they were not from Abraham. They would have to, if they're not coming through Isaac, they'd have to come through Ishmael. They have to be Arab people then. And nothing tends to that view, except whatever document they're talking about here, which apparently was misinterpreted. Verses 24 to 34, that was the treaty between Rome and Sparta and the Jews. 24 through 34, Jonathan ends up victorious in his battle against the forces of Antiochus VI again. The last verse of the preceding chapter said that he had defeated them and 3,000 Gentiles had perished. Now he ends up being successful again. As a matter of fact, they really are scared off to begin with. Verse 28, when the enemy heard that Jonathan and his men were ready for battle, they were alarmed. Their courage failed. They withdrew, first lighting watchfires in their camp. Jonathan and his men, seeing the watchfires burning, did not realize what had happened until morning. In other words, they thought the camps were occupied. They didn't know that it had just kind of been set to give them more time to get away. And they chase after them, verse 30, but they failed to catch them. Verses 35 to 38, very interesting, probably in another connection, such as a study of archaeology and the history of the Jewish temple. We have the building program going on in Jerusalem under Jonathan. Verses 35 through 38. Building program with regard to the temple, city walls, and the precincts thereof. When Jonathan returned, he convened the Senate. With their agreement, he decided to build fortresses in Judea, to heighten the walls of Jerusalem, and to erect a high barrier to separate the citadel from the city, and so to isolate it from the garrison, that the garrison could not buy or sell. They assembled to rebuild the city, for the wall along the ravine to the east had partly collapsed, and he repaired the section of the wall, so forth and so forth, the building of the wall. Then verses 39 to 53 are going to be sad because Jonathan is going to pass off the scene as well. Not dead, I don't think, until the next chapter, but he's going to pass off the scene. Remember how Judas died? And now Jonathan is going to end up dead in a similar way, traumatic way. He's tricked and he's captured by Trypho. Trypho is the behind-the-scenes figure in Syria, trying to play his own hand at the throne. He's tricked and he's captured by Trypho, the former friend of Ballas, who had his son Antiochus VI exalted in the place of Demetrius II, or at least along with him. Verses 39 through 53. Trypho now aspired to be king of Asia. Well, we've suspected that all along. He meant to rebel against King Antiochus, that was the very Antiochus that he put on the throne, and assume the crown himself. But he was afraid that Jonathan would fight to prevent this. So he cast about for some means of capturing and killing him. He set off and reached Bethshan, and Jonathan marched out to meet him with 40,000 picked troops, and he also reached there. And Trypho, seeing that Jonathan had a large force with him, was afraid to attack. So he received him honorably and commended him to all his friends, gave him presents, and ordered his friends and his troops to obey Jonathan as they would himself. He said to Jonathan, "Why have you put all these men to so much trouble when we are not at war?" Remember how they were able to get Demetrius to send his troops home, which was a mistake of his? We're going to see the same thing happen here. "Send them home now and choose a few to accompany you and come up with me to Ptolemais. I will hand it over to you with all the other fortresses." I doubt it's going to come that easy. "The rest of the troops and all the officials, and then I will leave the country." Trypho is saying that. Can you believe someone is as foolish as to do something like this? "This is the only purpose of my coming." So Jonathan took him at his word. That's what diplomacy does. You get to trusting the counterpart. And did as he said. He dismissed his forces, and they returned to Judea. And he kept back 3,000 men, of whom he left 2,000 in Galilee, while 1,000 accompanied him. But when Jonathan entered Ptolemais, the citizens closed the gates, seized him, and put to the sword all who entered with him. Trypho sent a force of infantry and cavalry into Galilee to the great plain to wipe out all Jonathan's men. They now learned that Jonathan had been seized and was lost, along with his escort. But they put hard into one another and marched in close formation, ready for battle. When their pursuers saw that they would fight to the death, and they turned back. So all came home safely to Judea, mourning for Jonathan and his followers, and filled with alarm. All Israel was plunged in grief. The surrounding Gentiles were now bent on destroying them root and branch. Remember, that was chapter 5. They did that earlier. Saying to themselves, the Jews have no leader or champion, so now is the time to attack, and we will blot out all memory of them among men. Well, we've got enough time to get into the next reign of the next individual, and that brings us into Simon. I'll only cover one chapter because in covering that we'll also end Jonathan's time, and we'll see Jonathan's death here. For your chart, miraculously, you'll have to go down to the very bottom line now, the far left-hand side. Although I probably will come back and comment on Leontopoulos next time. And we have one more thing on the far right-hand side of the second line, Jewish independence to speak of, but that will come here in the 13th chapter. Okay, verses 1 through 11. Verses 1 through 11. The new leader is picked. We've gone from Mattathias, the father, to Judas, the hammer, probably the best known of the brothers, to Jonathan, who's been a fairly good leader, except he got too involved in diplomacy. Now to Simon. Mattathias now through 3 brothers, Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. The news reached Simon that Trypho had mustered a large force for the invasion and destruction of Judea, and it threw the people into a state of panic. When Simon saw this, he went up to Jerusalem, called an assembly, and encouraged them in these words, so forth. He says in verse 4, I am the only one left. Now heaven forbid, there's a case of them avoiding the name of God, that I should grudge my own life in any moment of danger, for I am not worth more than my brothers. No, I will take up the cause of my nation in the holy place of your wives and children, since all the Gentiles in their hatred have gathered to destroy us. At these words the people plucked up courage. They shouted in answer, You shall be our leader in place of Judas and your brother Jonathan. Fight our battles, and we will do whatever you tell us. So Simon mustered all the fighting men and hurried on the completion of the walls of Jerusalem until it was fortified on all sides. He sent Jonathan, son of Absalom, with a considerable force to Joppa. He expelled its inhabitants and remained in possession of the town. Then we could just say from verse 12 to the end of the chapter, 53. Although it concerns different things, the most important thing will be the death of Jonathan. We're going to see the death of Jonathan. He's been taken as a prisoner in the preceding chapter. They've been mourning him in chapter 12, the middle of verse 52, for his capture, not for his death. We'll see his death here, and we'll see Jewish independence as well at the end of the chapter. Let's read these verses and we'll be through with this study this evening now. Trypho marched out from Ptolemais with a large force to invade Judea, taking Jonathan with him as a prisoner. You're down to around whatever the end of your chart is on that side, around 142 right now. Taking Jonathan with him as prisoner. Simon encamped at Adida at the edge of the plain. When Trypho learned that Simon had come forward to take the place of his brother Jonathan, that he was about to join battle with him, that he sent envoys to Simon with the following message. We are detaining your brother Jonathan. Going to try a little trickery on him because of certain monies which he owed to the royal treasury in connection with the offices he held. To ensure that he will not again revolt if we release him, send 100 talents of silver and 2 of his sons as hostages, and we will let him go. Simon happens to be smart enough to know it's a trick, but I mean, you have to save face or gain face in the eyes of your own people. What if he doesn't, and we find out later it was a true account, and Jonathan ends up dead as a result of it? Then Simon is to blame. So he's going to make an attempt, although he doesn't think it will work. Simon himself realized this was a trick, but he had the money and the children brought to him, fearing that otherwise he might arouse deep animosity among the people, who would say it was because you did not send the money and the children that Jonathan lost his life, which is what I just paraphrased. So he sent the children and the 100 talents, but Trypho broke his word and did not release Jonathan. After this, Trypho set out to invade the country and ravage it, taking a roundabout way. We end up with a severe snowstorm in verse 22. Yes, it can and does snow in that part of the world, but it's interesting. A severe snowstorm, which prevented their arrival, so he withdrew into Gilead. And then verse 23, when he reached Bascama, he had Jonathan put to death. Chapter 9, Judas is put to death. Chapter 13, Jonathan is put to death. And there he was buried. And Trypho then turned and went back to his own country. And so Simon had the body of his brother Jonathan brought to Modin and buried in the town of their fathers, and all Israel made a great lamentation and mourned him for many days. Simon built a high monument over the tomb of his father and his brothers, visible at a great distance, faced back and front with polished stone. He erected 7 pyramids, those for his father and mother and his 4 brothers, arranged in pairs. For the pyramids he contrived an elaborate setting, so for this mausoleum, which he made at Modin, stands to this day, the day of the penning of the book of 1 Maccabees. Verse 31, Trypho now plots against King Antiochus and murdered him, and this was a disaster for the country. Demetrius ends up, he's pictured again down in verse 36. More affairs between Trypho and the Syrian leadership and Simon, until we get down to the final verses 49 through 53. Again, a very significant section of 1 Maccabees. I try to point out what is extremely significant. The men in the citadel, I said one day would finally be back to the citadel where this problem would be taken care of, in Jerusalem, were prevented from going in and out to buy and sell in the country. Why? Remember what we read earlier. They erected a wall to keep them from going in and out. Famine set in, and many of them died of starvation. These are Syrians, remember, garrisoned in the citadel. They clamored to Simon to accept their surrender, and he agreed. He expelled them from the citadel and cleansed it from its pollutions. It was on the 23rd day of the 2nd month in the year 171 that he made his entry. This is May, started saying 1948. I'm thinking of their modern day independence. May 142 BCE. It happened to be May of 48 as well, that modern Israel became a sovereign nation and state again after all of these centuries. May 142, which your chart certainly would give that, as being so monumental of a date in Israel's history, Jewish independence begins. Now just notice in closing here that we don't count Jewish independence from way back, let's say 165, rededication of the temple after 3 years from December 168 to December 165. The whole time is because we continue to have problems. They end up with religious freedom because of getting their temple back in December of 165, but not political freedom because the Syrians still come and fight against them. Under Judas, most of the time, the Maccabees and the Jews are successful. But there are times, we've come across this several times here in 1 Maccabees, where politically they're not independent for a time because the Syrians actually gain control of the city of Jerusalem again. But whether they've had control of the city or the temple or not is beside the point. Always, from times prior to this down to this time, the Syrians have been in control of the citadel. That gives us at least one place on the Jewish map where the Syrians are in control. And it happens to be an important place, a well-fortified place, an appropriately situated place in Jerusalem itself, not far from the temple. So we don't date independence until we can get the last of the Syrians expelled and removed from the country. and we do in May of 142. And we can read the final notes. With a chorus of praise, waving of palm branches, lutes and cymbals, and zithers, with hymns and songs to celebrate Israel's final riddance of a formidable enemy. Simon decreed that this day should be observed as an annual festival, although it really wasn't. They kept up with Hanukkah, but they didn't keep up with this. He fortified the temple hill opposite the citadel. He and his men took up residence there. When Simon saw that his son John had become a man, then he made him commander of all the forces with Gazara as his headquarters. Okay, we're going to stop there and we'll pick up more with what goes on with Simon. You can look on your chart and see we'll be talking about Simon only for a short period of time, and then this very important figure of John Hyrcanus comes on the scene. That takes us through the last 12 years of Jonathan's reign and up into the first year of that of Simon.